Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and can I thank Joe and indeed the organising committee for inviting me back here to Glenties to speak to you this evening. It's a great privilege to be on the platform this evening with John and Olivia and you also, Don. John spoke about his daughter some years ago being dragooned to be here, and I asked my own daughter, who's 13, would she like to come to Glenties, and she said, "No chance whatsoever," she said. "You politicians are all the same, you love an audience." So if a girl of that age gets it so quickly, I think there's hope for the rest of us. I first met Joe Mulholland when I was a very young staffer in the Fine Gael press office, and he was in charge of RTE News as editor. And I remember on one occasion, we seemed to have a lot of Fine Gael leadership contests then. Everyone was trying to take out the existing leader, and John Bruton was challenged on this particular occasion. We were still a family at war, and on this particular occasion the question was who would go out with Nora Owen, who was the deputy leader of the party, to assure her going into a very important interview she was doing on 6-1. And I think Ivan Yates said at the time, "Well, Brian Hayes, you'll have to go and give not that I needed to give much sustenance to Nora Owen, I hasten to add, but just give her reassurance that everything would be fine." And when we got to RTE and Nora did the interview, and she came out of the, and I learned very quickly about the importance of reassuring politicians. She said to me, "How did I do?" I said, "Nora, you were fabulous, just fantastic." And behind my shoulder, Joe Mulholland also said, "Nora, you were just great." So politicians and reassurance go absolutely hand in hand. But later on, Joe took us to his office, and he said to Nora, "It's been a very difficult day and you might like a drink," and produced 3 large gin and tonics. And I said, "This is a wonderful place to work, RTE. 6:30 at night, they're all drinking gin and tonics, quaffing gin and tonics. Fantastic place to work." But there was the newsman in him, because Nora relaxed and she told him all the little bits of information and who was supporting who, and he had a headline on the 9 o'clock news, Morning Ireland the next day, and I said, "Therein lies a total press man to his fingertips, all done with 1 gin and tonic." So it's great to be back here. Since my election to the European Parliament, I'm always struck by the perception of my country outside of this country, which is not the same in this country. When I speak to people in the European Parliament, in the institutions, they have such a high regard for Ireland, what we've achieved, not just in terms of the recent crisis, but going back some years, some decades. A colleague of mine is a man called Alain Lamassoure. He's a French parliamentarian, a former European Affairs Minister in France, a very fine person in his 70s. And he said, "Brian, I used to go to Ireland in the 60s and 70s. I was there in the 1973 campaign. I remember it well," he said. "Ireland was a very poor country. And look what you have done as a consequence of the opportunities of the European Union. Yes, you've obtained funds, structural funds and the like. But," he said, "of any country in the European Union which has transformed itself over the period of membership, it's Ireland." I've always been struck by that this perception of Ireland abroad is so much better than the perception of Ireland here. And I think we have had real success. I mean, both Olivia and John spoke about the issues of corporate taxation, and I might just deal with that issue. Yes, there is a global problem about how much tax we take from the corporate sector. The average OECD is about 10%. In other words, if you actually do the pie chart of where you get the tax from, the average OECD is about 10% coming from the corporates. In Ireland, it's 15%. It's doubled in the course of the last 4 years. And some of that is down to the increase in the economy, the improvement in the world economy. But actually, a lot of it is down to the OECD agenda that is now being followed. And yes, tax loopholes do exist, remain in place, but there are fewer of them than was the case some years ago. And yes, we have reputational problems in Ireland internationally because of the taxation issues, Apple being one of them. But this idea that there is no new agenda on corporate tax is not the case. If one looks, for instance, at the country-by-country reporting, which is a huge issue for the European Parliament, and Ireland supports that. If we look at the automatic tax exchange codes that have been established in the last 5 years, there has been substantial change in the tax area. So I think it's only fair to say that the whole question of corporate tax is on the international agenda. The dilemma for Ireland is, do we go further and faster where we create a competitive advantage for other member states? And I also agree with John, we need to look at the question of the CCCTB. It's not so much about the rate, it's more about consolidation and what is the base and what you pay and what you don't pay. But the dilemma is always, do we create competitive advantages for other countries? And that's not easy to solve in a very globalised society. But what I want to ensure, and I hope the Irish government, if they were here, would want to assure the same thing, is we get more from the corporates. That has happened in the course of, and the dilemma is, if it's knocked out by $1 billion or $2 billion over the course of the next year, where are we going to find that $1 billion or $2 billion? People talking about new taxes need to be clear, what are they talking about? Very easy to talk in generalities about where we're going to get this money, but we need to see the specifics. And I know that might sound very dull and rudimentary and not exactly very inspiring, but we need to have a genuine debate on taxation in this country, and I think the corporate tax area is one. Real successes over the last number of decades. We've gone from a country of 1 million people at work to 2 billion people at work. There is no Western country that I'm aware of that has effectively doubled its labour force. We forget that. It happened over a 20-year period. Yes, we have an internationalised economy. Yes, it bobs up and down based on where businesses are. But I have no doubt that the presence of the FDI sector in Ireland has been hugely beneficial, not just for direct employment, but also especially in terms of a new kind of entrepreneurial class. The reason why John is right in saying that a lot of the new jobs in recent years have been on the Irish exporting front, the domestic economy, they have come from the fact that we've had large businesses here for so many decades. And I think we should recognise that fact. 60% of the age cohort go on to some form of third level education. It was 20% in the 1980s. One of the reasons I think we've managed the whole globalisation issue is because we have a very high participation rate in third level education. That is not the case in other EU member states. I think we have the highest level of participation in third level of any EU member state. Average pay in Ireland is the 4th highest in the European Union, the 4th highest. When we joined the European Union in 1973, average pay was 60% of what the average was across the other member states. It's now, even after the crash, 25% more where the average is now. Some achievement, I would have thought, over a relatively short period of time. John spoke about population. In 1960, we had a population of 2.8 million people, admittedly the lowest point. We now have, I think it's 4.7, if the CSO are to be believed in their projections, and they were right in the last 20 years. By 2050, we'll have close to 6 million people, effectively a doubling of the Irish population over a 90-year period. And even on tax, despite what Olivia says, the OECD says that we have the second most progressive income taxation system across the membership of the OECD. The top 1%, pay 20% of the totality of income tax. The top 1%, the top 10%, the guys and the ladies at the top of the tree income-wise pay 60% of the totality of income tax. That is not some kind of capitalist blue haven. That is a very progressive income tax regime. Now, of course, we need to broaden the tax base. We tried to do that rather unsuccessfully on the question of water. Next time, best of luck to people if they're making proposals. But broadening up the tax base is important. All of the capital taxes went up in the madness in the years that we were in government, 2011. Capital taxes all went up. VAT went up at the top rate. We introduced a pension levy. We introduced a levy on the banks. So this argument that Ireland is some kind of tax haven in terms of the totality of tax, I mean, I don't think it actually stacks up. On the UN Human Development Index, Ireland is the top 10 countries in terms of being most developed, in terms of social policy, which sometimes belies a lot of the negativity you hear. What I'm really saying is there is a kind of portrayal of Ireland, which I hear in this country, with people kind of gorging out constantly on what's wrong with Ireland. And there are many, many things wrong with this country that we've got to sort out. But I think it has to be balanced by what are relative achievements over a very short period of time since our membership of the European Union, and even since the collapse of the economy that was caused as a consequence of the banking crash. Olivia spoke about some issues around Leo Varadkar, I watched his election to the Dáil from the safety of a screen in Brussels, I hasten to add, and the debate on it at that day in the Dáil. And I was really surprised by the utter negativity of the contributions that were made. I mean, this was like some kind of hellhole of Calcutta that people were talking about. This was an amazing achievement. A guy at 38 years of age with no connection to politics. His mum or his dad weren't a TD, not the traditional Irish way of doing it. Clearly got there by meritocracy, clearly got there because he was seen by his party as the best. But I couldn't get over how negative the comment was that day and the portrayal of our country in terms of the contributions that were made. And I think we have got to have some balance in this in terms of the Dáil and in terms of public comment as to what's happened. My central point is, ladies and gentlemen, which I'll make later on, but I just want to touch on now, is that if we look, for instance, at the whole question of Europe, I remember the 2016 campaign. I was in the middle of it as Director of Elections of our campaign. We won't talk about that this evening. I remember it very well. I mean, there was no question of Europe raised at any stage in the 2016 general election campaign. There was no question on Europe raised in the most recent leadership campaign in my own party between Leo and Simon. You'll recall all those extraordinary, exciting hustings for our party up and down the country. I don't remember any question on Europe that was raised at the time. And my central point is this. I think we are obsessed with ourselves. We do not look at international comparisons. We don't actually see where international issues are going. We have 2 full-time Irish journalists in Brussels, and those poor people have to also go across the rest of Europe as a means of getting their story out. And I think, you know, if we are going to take the future seriously, we have got to take Europe seriously, and we just don't do that for whatever reason. It's not particularly strong within our DNA. Some good news. We're all living longer. That's the good news. You're going to be here in 10 years' time. You're going to be here back in Glenties. That's the good news. And the population is growing, as I said. There's a recognition of the increase in population, which is always a good sign. A friend of mine said recently that, you know, another 1 million people over the next 30 years that the CSO are predicting is effectively the equivalence of 12 Crow Parks that are totally full. So you can think of that when you're watching Dublin play Donegal in September. But this idea, and the very best of luck to that too, so it's an extraordinary concept of another 1 million people in the country by 2050. And as John said, over 65s, currently I think about 650,000 people. By 2050, 1.4 million. Over 85s, there's 150,000 over 85s in the country at the moment. I know because my mother is one of them. And by 2050, there will be 500,000. So that demographic change in Ireland is going to cause huge issues in terms of a whole range of issues on housing, on healthcare, on pensions, on climate change that John spoke about. And how we manage that, I think, will be hugely important for the future. As to the future, I have a 5-point plan. You heard that before with Enda Kenny, but this is in the current version. I have a 5-point, and it's better than let's keep the recovery going as a concept. You can be absolutely reassured by that. But my 5-point plan really is, one, I'm arguing for the need for a centre ground politics to re-emerge and to hopefully dominate. Slightly different to what Olivia has to say, but I'll go on about that. Secondly, why I believe it's so important that we have a new relationship with the European Union, a much more mature relationship. Thirdly, how I believe, why I think it's important that we can become, within a matter of 5 to 10 years, a core country of the Eurozone, which I think has huge advantages long term. Fourthly, the need for relentless benchmarking of ourselves to similar sized countries across the EU. And then fifthly, why it's important that why global prosperity and Ireland go hand in hand, actually, and the opportunities that provides for Ireland. On the first question, centre ground. I've learned quite a bit in recent years in the European Parliament how politics is done there. And politics throughout the world is not that different, you know, the good, the bad and the ugly. But Irish politics in recent years has become very personalised, very toxic, very negative, difficult to watch. It's difficult to watch the Dáil right now at the moment. There's a kind of a pantomime on steroids by people, constantly exaggerating and hyperbole and over-exaggerating things. And caricaturing things. And I think it's understandable at one level, the collapse of the country and ultimately its comeback was put on the shoulders of the centre ground politicians, Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, the Labour Party, the Green Party. All of those parties have suffered electoral loss as a consequence of the decisions that they've had to take. But in the European Parliament, you do get a sense that the issue is more important than the political manoeuvring. People are genuinely serious about building consensus, not getting a majority of one, which is very much in the Irish political system, but actually broadening the majority, having a big majority, winning the argument across the Parliament rather than having a slim majority, and accommodating difference. I was struck, the leader of our group, the European People's Party, Manfred Weber, was speaking at a group meeting one night when the Green Party were putting forward this argument why we need a tax one committee to take up some of these questions on corporate tax. And they only had a minority. But it was like something that went off in his head. He said, this is a significant minority. We cannot ignore these people. We have to accommodate on the terms of reference to get a special tax committee. You would not have heard that in the Dáil. And it was as if something in the history of German politics and the toxic problem of Nazism in the 30s and 40s went off in his head to say, this is the way in which politics is done. We don't do that in the Oireachtas. It's a winner-take-all system, very localised, and the dilemma is that I don't think sometimes that we get the right policy options from that. But I was struck by the way in which politics can transform decision-making in the European Parliament and elsewhere. We actually have at the moment, if you look at the polls, three political blocs, large blocs, or four you could argue, Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, Sinn Féin, and the group of independents. I personally don't believe that the current Dáil is working in terms of making the hard choices on some of the issues that John spoke about, because those are hard decisions which affect people in the here and now, and you're actually asking people to pay up more or take a longer period of time for not receiving something, which is always very difficult. I think after the next election, what is crucially important is to have a stable government for a 5-year period. And I do agree with Olivia, the decision of Sinn Féin to effectively say that they want to now be part of a government is a game changer in terms of the potential of that new Dáil. As long as the leadership of Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil and the current leadership is there, that will not be countenanced in terms of Sinn Féin in government. And obviously we will have to wait and see the election. But it seems to me that the only logical outcome post the next election, in a circumstance where Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil and Sinn Féin are the three biggest groups, is to have a grand coalition between Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil for a 5-year period that can wrestle with some of these issues and be prepared to make the hard decisions that are required to get us into the position we need to be in 2040 and 2050. And I say that in a circumstance where actually the trend of the next election could change. The combined FG-FF vote at the last general election was just barely 50%, down 30%, 35% over a period of 20 years. It is very possible that the next election, that trend will go up in terms of the collective vote of both of those parties. And I do think it's in Ireland's interest that we have a stable, coherent centre government, because it is the centre ground that is coming back. It's not necessarily social democracy that's coming back. Actually, the most recent moves have been to the Liberal parties, our Christian Democratic parties, not actually towards social democratic parties. And it's the content of what that centre government could do on things like pensions, third level education, how we fund that, climate change, housing. The hard decisions which require a majority in the Dáil. So I'm optimistic on the future of centre ground politics, and I think the option of a grand coalition, which works perfectly well in Germany, even though Social Democrats are a smaller party with Angela Merkel there, I think can work in Ireland too. Secondly, we need a new relationship with the European Union. We need to get away from the bail-booked attitude. Yes, we all know we obtained, 57 billion since we joined the European Union. We need to stop seeing everything that's wrong with Europe as the responsibility of faceless bureaucrats in Brussels. We don't have faceless bureaucrats, as you know, in Dublin. We only have them in Brussels. And I think it is part of the kind of childish debate that we have in terms of seeing exactly where Europe is. I think you are beginning to see a stronger Europe coming back after the Brexit issue. The election of Macron is very, very significant. And Angela Merkel, I think, will be re-elected as German Chancellor this September. And we always need to see a strong German-Franco alliance in terms of moving the European Union forward. But too often, we blame Europe for the things that have nothing to do with Europe. Every decision that's taken is a co-decision between an Irish government and every other government and the European Parliament. And everything that's good, of course, is down to the Irish government. Everything that's bad is down to the faceless bureaucrats. So I think it's crucially important that we change the debate on Europe and make sure that we have a much more mature relationship. And because we are going to become net contributors rather than net beneficiaries, that means we will have much more say in how the budget is divvied out, but also we will be contributing to poorer member states of the European Union, especially to the East, as we received significant funding over the years as well. And I think that is important as well. There is also, and Olivia touched on it as well, we need to have a genuine debate about what happened. I think while everyone does not want to go back to 2008, 2009, the truth of the matter, the reason why we have 200 billion euros worth of debt is not down to the banking collapse. It's down to the difference between tax and expenditure over a 5-year period when effectively we were out of the markets. 15% of the totality of Irish public debt is down to the banks and the bailout, but 85% has nothing to do with it. And so often we have this kind of very simplistic argument that in some way Europe is responsible for this. I think Europe failed us in many respects by not having a proper architecture for financial governance in the run-up to the collapse, no doubt about that. But the argument that all of the Irish debt is simply down to German banks is a kind of a bogeyman argument that suits people to make, but actually it's not true. And I think that has to be challenged frequently right the way across our society. I think it's also important that we try to create new alliances. Now that the British are leaving, and I agree with John, in more recent years we did rely on them in terms of financial taxation issues and certainly the regulatory environment, but we also need to make new alliances with the Benelux countries, with the countries to the east especially, those countries that have come out of the communist yoke, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. We have a great opportunity as an older member state of doing things differently. My third remark is, I think between 5 and 10 years we can become a core member state of the Eurozone. And that means getting our debt levels down. I think 40% is realistic over a 10-year period. I think that will have the advantage of bringing more investment into the country. And I also think it will have the advantage of making sure that the comeback of Ireland is a long-term systemic comeback, potentially growth of maybe 2 to 3 to 4% over a 10-year period. We could radically transform the country by the options where nearly the economy could grow by a third over that period of time. But the crucial issue is to reach a balanced budget by next year. Because once you hit your balanced budget under the fiscal rules, you then have the flexibility to do more spending in the things you want to do. And I think that is something that we should not lose sight of. But being part of the core rather than the periphery makes sure that we can protect ourselves at the time of the next crisis. Fourthly, we need benchmarking, and John touched on this. We need to benchmark ourselves against similar-sized economies right the way across the Eurozone. What have they done? What have they done in terms of educational training opportunities? What have they done on pensions service reform? Look at the transformation in Estonia when it came to digital platforms and transform. They have transformed public services by being the most advanced country in the European Union as a consequence of the digital platform. But we also need to come back to some golden rules. We should not increase public expenditure, in my view, greater than where we see real growth in the Irish economy. We should continue to put funds into a rainy day. One of the best things that Charlie McCreevy did was to introduce the National Pension Reserve Fund, because he recognised the pension liability coming down the tracks and the necessity for saving. We should all get back to that. And we should respect the advice of the Fiscal Advisory Council. The reason why we have a fiscal advisory bill, responsibility bill rather, is to ensure that we don't get into this mess again. And those golden rules need to be upheld. And then my last hope for the future is that, despite other people with this kind of argument against globalization, I think globalization is a good thing. I think the reason why we have high levels of education has helped our country, because we were never an industrial society. The reason why we've managed to come back so strongly, because we're an export-orientated country, is because of our globalization. Yes, we have an FDI footprint. We all recognize that. Absolutely, that's the case. But the real comeback of Europe, and 90% of the growth this year in the world is not in Europe, it's in emerging parts of Europe. Europe is becoming an older, less competitive, less growth-orientated region of the world vis-à-vis other parts of the world, is because world trade has not come back strongly since the financial crisis. If you take 2000 until 2008, the rate of growth of trade internationally is half the rate of growth since 2008 to 2016. So we're perfectly well positioned between, on the west of Europe, English-speaking, common law jurisdiction, close to the United States historically. We're perfectly positioned to gain from the opportunities of globalization. And the globalization argument is readily put forward by the left as something negative. I don't see it that way. I see it as something positive. Ireland's foothold in the world has dramatically increased as a consequence of our internationalized economy, and it's something I think we should be proud about. My last remark is this. It was John's father, Garrett, who delivered the Dimbleby lecture in the early 1970s. And there was an amazing achievement, actually, for a former, I think at the time he was leader of the opposition, or he was Foreign Affairs Minister. But he did speak in that speech about the kaleidoscope being shattered when it came to British-Irish relations. And what he was really saying was, no one can predict what's going to happen, because everything has been turned upside down. And I think if you look at what's happening in the world, the disruption of the Trump election, the disruption of Brexit, we need a safe haven. We need safety, having come through the worst financial crisis in our history. And I believe we need to pivot towards the European Union. We have responsibilities now as an older member state, as a wealthy country. We need to take more responsibility on issues like security and defence. We need to show more solidarity. And we need to have a much more serious debate about what is happening in the European Union, and to become less obsessed about the daily struggles that are happening in the news, which are all forgotten about the following week because everyone's moved on to a new, less relevant story. That's the challenge we face, ladies and gentlemen. I think if we get that right, and if we change our responsibility and change the debate on Europe and become part of the core of Europe, I think it is the best security for this country in the time ahead. Thank you very much.